the newsagents.
Beth, I might just gently say, Sky invite us to quite a lot of hospitality events. Your summer party is a great party costing thousands of pounds, and you invite me every year. Presumably you want politicians to continue to come, and part of that is how politics...
Keir Starmer, again being asked about freebies, about free tickets, about apartments, about clothes. And the argument is, even if everything's above board, the optics are bad. But should we worry about the optics if everything is above board? And are we, journalists, purer than pure?
Yeah, today we're wondering about the kind of coverage and where it's coming from, and whether this is actually shifting the dial in terms of how Labour behaves, or whether it's simply telling us more about the UK press. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
In a moment, we'll be talking to Diane Abbot about that row with Keir Starmer and other things. But first...
Well, it is the 26th of September, and I think that, it is a date that is very much etched into the annals of history, Emily, as we know. I mean, it's the 1960 first televised presidential debate. Francis Drake completed circumnavigation of the globe. Concorde made its first non-stop transatlantic flight, and in 1969 the Beatles released Abbey Road. But in many ways
all that will be forgotten.
All of that will pale in to the far distant rearview mirror of history, because of course, what is today, John?
Strangerland.
Today, Strangerland is published.
No, it's Strangeland. Everyone is now calling it Strangerland.
Well, you came up with the bloody title.
Well, she came up. Is it my fault she can't read?
Strangeland is out today. Are you excited, John?
Yeah, I am. I mean, nervous, excited, apprehensive, all the rest.
Imagine how they felt, the Concorde lads felt back in 1969. I mean, honestly, if you think that's bad.
Well, I'm aiming to break
JFK, Nixon, Sopel.
Yeah.
I'm aiming to break the sound barrier tonight. Right. When I hit Mach 2 at the launch party.
Will not involve any hospitality, which is what we're going to be speaking about.
Yeah. It'll be my hospitality to you.
Have you got any politicians coming?
There may be one or two.
And will you be giving them free drinks?
No, I'm going to make them pay. It's going to be a paid bar for them.
Yeah, that does not surprise me. That does not surprise me.
But this whole question of kind of MPs taking hospitality, having to make a declaration... Have we gone slightly mad? Look, I think there are times when we're absolutely right to call some of this stuff out. But this equivalence that all politicians have got their noses in the trough and they're all as bad as each other and they're all a pile of shit, I think is just misplaced. And I think, Starmer having his kid in some flat so that he could get on with his GCSEs without film crews on the doorstep, seems to me, what's the big deal?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting moment, because obviously the question around hospitality has sort of been around for about a week now. It's kind of got bigger and bigger and bigger, and every day there are new stories about it. In many ways, it kind of lives in the sort of long shadow that's been there since the expenses crisis of 2009. It feels like it's got a kind of like familiar rhythm. Basically, journalists go to the register of interests, they find out what's been happening here, and they start talking about it, and there's a sort of appetite, I think, from parts of the press to recreate some of those dynamics. I think therefore it becomes more and more important for us to sort of really consider what we're dealing with here and how serious we think it is. And obviously there have been different elements to this story, and you can definitely say there have been, and if you talk to people around the Labour leadership now, they will acknowledge there's definitely been some misjudgments. Some of the stuff around the clothes and the glasses, for example, really necessary, hard to justify when you've got a Prime Minister who is clearly a man of means in all sorts of ways, having someone else pay for their clothes. The optics around that, fine. I do wonder whether in the last 24 to 48 hours, we've taken it to another place, which is, I actually think, on the verge of maybe not being entirely proper in terms of how it's being reported. There's no particular criticism towards Beth or Sky, who are both brilliant, but it is this element of criticism around, for example, this flat of Lord Ali, which basically the Starmers have used during the election campaign. Keir Starmer gave that explanation about it, saying that there were journalists around his house and so on, and it was a good place for his son, who's preparing for his GCSEs, to study. I think there is a way around this is reported, because what we do is we say, this is a £20,000 donation to Keir Starmer. But in fact, it's not £20,000, right? all it is, because of the way that it's been reported, is you have to put a numerical value on what they think has basically been donated. So you basically say, we think that if this were available privately, which it wouldn't be, then this would be roughly worth £20,000. But the problem is that when it's written up in headlines in that way, it kind of implies that money has changed hands, or there has been a literal numerical donation, and there hasn't been.
I think what you said about the expenses scandal goes right to the heart of this. And it's this absolute visceral disgust or visceral knee-jerk about the use of public money. And I guess, you know me, I will always bring everything back to the financial crash. I think the world begins and ends with the financial crash.
Well, you only watch films about the financial crash, is your line.
Well, rightly so, I think. But the point is that whatever that did broke this bond. And now you can see whether it's the BBC, public money, you know, expenses, public money, sort of Quangos, public money, these donations, public money. People have just run out of patience with the idea of their money being used on anything.
Although this isn't public money. I mean, this is private money from Ali.
Isn't that interesting? But somehow it has become part of the story that the Prime Minister is doing things that other people wouldn't do. And part of that is because he is the Prime Minister. Most people don't have queues and queues of journalists outside their house, right? It's as simple as that.
But look at the circularity of, and particularly that clip, and we all know it, that, you know, the news organisations we've worked for have invited kind of senior people to dinners, or you know, the BBC will have a box at the cup final because the BBC is the host broadcaster, and that will be it. And you invite someone there, and you say, well, what's the value of a box at the cup final? Well, that must be a few £1,000 because they don't come cheap for cup finals, or World Cup final, or the Olympic Games, or whatever it happens to be. And then you beat the politician over the head for having accepted it in an interview you do later.
Yeah, whether it's the BBC proms or it's Wimbledon or it's whatever.
Exactly.
Because presumably the idea of inviting a politician, and you know, your book launch, which we said jokingly, is a case in point. You invite people, A, who you probably like or talk to, and B, who, you know, might come on the podcast, right?
Exactly.
Are you influenced by them? You know, I think that's the big question, right? It's whether the gifting means that you are influenced, yield something.
I think that's completely right. And I think this is, and again, I mean, as Starmer said to Beth there, perfectly legitimate to ask the question, and these questions should be asked. But I suppose journalists, we have to, therefore, and I've talked to people at Number 10 about this over the course of last week, we therefore then have to be ready to have the kind of rejoinder put back, which is to say, look, journalists can receive hospitality as well. You know, perfectly legitimate to ask that question. Would you say, or we say, as journalists, that if we receive hospitality from someone or other, from our company or whatever, or an event, say, or free tickets to go and see a play, or I don't know what it is, does that inherently influence us? Does that mean that we're therefore not going to report on that company or whoever it happens to be?
And what is your obligation? If you go and see a play that you hate, right, on a free ticket, are you allowed to say, that was the biggest pile of shit?
Yeah, well,
I don't think you are. I mean, you know, but you should be able to.
But you should be able to. But I know that's what I mean in a way. It's the principle. So if we, as journalists, feel that we can be given hospitality or whatever it happens to be, and therefore, but still feel unencumbered in terms of our reporting, then the same logic must also apply to politicians. I mean, as someone once said in politics, if you can't go to someone's event, take their booze, and then vote against them, you shouldn't be in this business. And there is an element of this. It's about your behaviour, and I don't think that is coming across in at least some of the coverage at the moment.
So the flip side is if Wahid Ali then said, I really, really hate this policy you've got on X.
Yes, completely.
Right? Then what happens? If he says, oh, are you sure about this winter fuel allowance thing? Because my grandmother's, really old and she hates it. Oh, what do you do then? And you have to believe that the people, in Number 10 are not going to be moved by that. I
think the thing that makes me uncomfortable about this whole debate is that people are expecting this level of purity, and if a politician accepts to go to something, they've been bought. Or even if a journalist goes to something, they've been bought. We get offered hospitality, and depending on what the hospitality is, and if you think if it's a Taylor Swift ticket, we say, yes, please, that would be wonderful. And if it's something, obscure bit of Shostakovich at some kind of dingy place, you think, well, probably not. But the idea that we're being bought along the way, you go to these things because you think you might meet some interesting people who might come onto the podcast and learn some interesting things.
But this is to Beth's point, right? Just to get back to the basics. her question was that most people do not have that opportunity. Most people do not have a multimillionaire best mate with an £18 million penthouse. I think most people, frankly, if you're offered a freebie, if your mate owns a pub and says, would you like to have your kid's 18th in my pub? They'd probably say yes, right? I don't think that sounds particularly weird. I think it sounds like exactly what most people would do. But I think the gap comes between what we assume those at the top who rule us, which comes again back to public money. It's not the fact that Wahid Ali's money wasn't private, it's the fact that Keir Starmer is our Prime Minister, right? And he is getting paid by the public purse. Therefore, we think we can demand a certain level of behaviour from him.
So would it have been okay if he'd accepted the donation of a flat from somebody who lived in, in a council flat? Fine. In a house like you and I live in? Is that okay? Or is that... Because
it's really
a lot
interesting.
of people...
So if he was doing a campaign rally in Halifax, right, and he stayed overnight for a week in Halifax, would anyone mind? No.
Exactly.
But because there's a different way. Again, this is where I think the rules around transparency, in a way, are actually... they're actually, you could argue, fueling the cynicism, right? Which is to say that there's another way of looking at that story, which is he's basically stayed in a friend's house. But by attaching a numerical value to it, it's making it perhaps seem like something it shouldn't. That's not to say that there aren't legitimate questions about the amount of money that Ali has given, about the fact that he did get, briefly after the election, a Downing Street pass, which Number 10 have not satisfactorily answered. And there is a wider question, which I think all of this coverage is kind of ignoring, which is to say, well, actually, do we really want private donors of any political party or hue being so intimately involved in the way these parties operate, and therefore maybe it would be better an idea to have more public or state funding of political parties to withdraw.
And no one is going to say yes to that.
Exactly.
I'd love to pay more for my politics.
So this is what I mean. So the public can't have it both ways, and this is, I think, the debate we need to be having, which is, okay, you want to get rid of that perception problem, even if there is not an actual problem, fine, but then political parties, which are important, do have to be funded somehow. And if you're the Prime Minister, by the way...
I think it's not just about the kind of details of the money. I think it goes to something bigger, which is either we think of the Prime Minister as this extraordinary role, in our country's place. You have Downing Street, you have Chequers, you have a gated entrance, you have police and security.
They're not a member of the public.
They're not really a normal
Minister.
member of the public. Just like the Queen. There's all this stuff about the Queen having a gold piano. Wait till you find out about the 6 palaces, right? You can't have it both ways. If you have a monarchy, then yes, they're going to be things that you couldn't possibly dream of having in your own house. And I guess somewhere along the lines, we've got to stop being hypocritical about that.
We'll be back after the break with Diane Abbot.
Well, joining us now is Diane Abbot, who's published her first book, A Woman Like Me. And I guess, Diane, if this book had a word cloud around it, then one of the biggest words would be black, because you talk a lot about what it's like to have encountered racism virtually your entire life. But the other word would be first, because you broke a lot of barriers. You became the first, or one of the first, at virtually everything you did. I mean, including the hospital where you were born in Paddington, where I think you were, the first or one of the first black babies that they'd seen there. I wonder what that has done to your sense of yourself, sort of having to feel like you are this pioneer with every thing that you try and do.
I have never thought of myself as a pioneer until I started to write the book and had to look back. I have just got on with it. Remember, I was the first black child at my primary school. I was the first black girl at my grammar school. So it's just what it's been like.
You described that very warm, wider family atmosphere in the early chapters of sort of the Caribbean front room, and actually the move that you made from Paddington and all the friends and family there to the suburbs of Harrow, which felt very sort of neat lawns and not where the rest of your clan and your family were. And also the sort of complications of your father, who was so smart in terms of making the moves that would give you that progress, and a terrible bully to your mother too, who then left. I mean, that must have been devastating.
Yeah, my mother had to run away because my father was very controlling. But it's only now I can look back and see why he was like that. he had to absorb a lot of racism out there in the world, and he came home and he kind of visited upon his family, which is sad in a way, but we were estranged for years and years. But my brother has recently told me a story that even after my father and I had, I'd moved out, we were on terribly bad terms. My brother says he used to keep the slip of paper with my O-level results on it, and they were all A's, 7, 8, 9 A's, I don't know, and he'd keep it in his back pocket, and wherever he went, slightest excuse, he'd whip it out, which is very irritating for my brother, because he didn't whip out his O-level results. So despite everything, looking back, I can see that my father was proud of me, but maybe we were too similar. That's why we clashed.
It's impossible, I guess, to know, the alternative version of history, isn't it? But you might not have grown up in England. Your parents might not have come in the Windrush generation. You might have been a more whole family, and yet a less achieved woman now. Do you ever sort of think of that? Do you think that that's what split the family up? Your father having to constantly deal with racism?
I think it did help to split the family up. I went back to Jamaica with my mother for the first time when I was in my early 20s, and I loved it. And I met my grandmother, who I'd not met before, and I think if I'd been brought up in Jamaica, I would have had a very happy childhood. Whether I would have been a British Member of Parliament is another question.
Yeah. And I mean, this goes to the other things really, because at school, I think a teacher accused you of cheating and you didn't recognise that for what it was, a kind of a form of racism. You then went to Cambridge and again, sort of pushing barriers when people thought that you couldn't do that. I'm wondering what was it that made you have that kind of self-belief? Because, Cambridge is intimidating. I was intimidated at college and I didn't face racism, and yet you had this sort of sense of, yeah, damn it, I'm going to... Where did that come from?
My family's Jamaican, and if you know any Jamaicans, we're quite, we do generally have a sense of self-belief. One of my uncles told me a story. He went to Florida in the 50s to pick fruit, because that's what Caribbean people did. And I think the first week he picked his fruit, and then there was a little shed where you could get your wages. And the white workers all went inside the shed to get their wages, but the black workers were supposed to queue outside. When my uncle saw this, he thought this was quite wrong, and he burst into the shed. And after that, all the black workers were able to get their money inside. There is something about Jamaicans, there is something about my family that we don't take nonsense.
A sort of ballsiness.
Yes, that's what my family is like. That's what my father was like. And in her own way, that's what my mother was like. That's why she ran away from my father and got back to nursing.
I mean, I'm going to fast forward a bit, because it was after Cambridge and these sort of sherry parties that you described, like what was everyone doing, standing around drinking sherry, that you then almost got back into real life. In the civil service, you then worked in the Home Office, prisons. You met these formative characters for you, like Ken Livingstone, Jeremy Corbyn, who you dated. And then I'm going to pull you forward because, people will most recently associate you with the rise of Jeremy Corbyn and the part that you played in his cabinet and that defeat in 2019. And I'm wondering if you felt responsible. I mean, not you personally, but you as a cabinet. Did you sort of look at yourselves after that and say, this is the worst defeat Labour's ever had? Were we tin-eared? Or did you blame the media like Corbyn did? Or how did you make sense of it after that? I
read history. And history teaches you that things go up and down and things don't always turn out the way you want. And I personally felt we'd done our best, and that's all you can do. So as I said, because history was my subject at university, I just put it in a kind of framework. It was just what happened.
And was that enough? Because I think, when Starmer comes in, he says, that wasn't good enough. We were the wrong party.
Yeah,
we didn't listen. We didn't hear.
I'm sorry. When Starmer ran for the leadership after Jeremy stepped down, he presented himself as a new Jeremy, but more acceptable. He did a little video as part of his campaign, and if you watch the video, you would have thought that he was at the heart of every industrial dispute since the miners' strike. Well, of course he wasn't. He presented himself as Corbyn number 2, and when he took up the role as leader, he made a big thing of saying, how much he respected Jeremy, blah, blah, blah. It took a little bit of time for him to turn around and be the Starmer that we all know today.
And he's explained that by saying that actually the Labour of 2019 was a disaster for the British people. It allowed in, a hard Brexit, a Boris Johnson government, all the lies and duplicity that followed after that. I mean, don't you think back now and think, oh my God, if we hadn't been led down that alley with Jeremy Corbyn, maybe we could have avoided what happened afterwards.
No, I don't think that. I think we did our best, and we did it for the right reasons, and it worked out badly, as you're saying, but no. People keep saying to me, do you wish you'd done something else? I'm not talking about the Labour Party now. Do you have any regrets? And so on. And I always say, I don't really have any regrets because I made mistakes, goodness knows. But my mistakes are part of me. You are who you are, and your mistakes are part of who you are. And 2019 was awful. It was really awful. But I just thought we did what we could do. And the media made Jeremy out to be a monster, and he was never that.
I don't. You think the media did?
Yes, and he was never that. What can you do? I mean, if I was somebody that wouldn't do anything because I felt I might lose, I would never have done the things I've done in my life.
So I guess you're saying monster, and people listening to this would say he allowed a very toxic culture around him, and this was something that was highlighted by the Martin Ford report. I mean, I remember, trying to cover Labour in those days, and it was vitriolic. You did not want to be a journalist at that time. It was absolutely vitriolic. The stuff that, many of us got back as women or as Jewish people or as journalists was horrifying. When Keir Starmer became leader, he commissioned the Ford report, and Corbyn was then suspended from the party for, I guess, something that was a mixture of a failure to apologise or a failure to recognise the scale of the problem of the environment that he created in the Labour Party around those close to him at that time.
Well, I'm the Member of Parliament for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, despite what Keir Starmer tried to do. And I don't recognise what you're saying about a toxic atmosphere in my own party. I mean,
Never.
No, Hackney is historically a Jewish area. People moved out from the East End to Hackney and then beyond. I still have the 7th largest Jewish community in the country. There was no toxic anti-Semitism.
Do you think people made it up?
I'm not saying people made it up. I'm just saying that I don't recognise that Labour Party.
The Labour Party that you then remained a part of, I guess, then suspended you. You wrote a letter after a Guardian column which had suggested that racism against travellers or Jews wasn't as extreme because it wasn't visible. You very quickly retracted that. You apologised. It was a full-throated sort of understanding that it had been written in too much haste. What happened then between you and the Labour leadership?
First, I should say I apologised within hours because I realised it had been poorly written. I mean, my point was that racism about skin colour is different from other types of racism, but I put it very badly. The next day, Starmer was asked about it, and he said, well, I think it was anti-Semitic. So then there was an inquiry, and the inquiry went on and on. Because remember, it was a 125-word letter, and the inquiry went on for 7 months.
Why do you think it took so long?
I think they strung out the inquiry because had they completed the inquiry and thrown me out of the Labour Party, then my local party would have been able to pick my successor. And being a left party, they would have chosen a left-wing successor. And the people around Starmer didn't want that to happen. So they strung it out and strung it out. The thinking was that when...
So this was about a purging, you think?
Oh, my goodness.
You're in no doubt.
Of course it was. Of course it was. And some of my colleagues in the Labour Party at the time were very grateful that I stood up to Starmer at that point, because they believed if I hadn't sort of toughed it out, they would have been cleared out at that point.
It was then revealed, I think by Newsnight, that a judgment had been made long ago, I think last December, November. It was very hard. I remember this, Diane. It was very hard to hear from you directly. We contacted you and we wanted to hear your side of the story. And the fact that you wouldn't go publicly on record suggested that you were still in a very delicate situation, trying to work things out. So what was going on then when you'd been told did you know that you could stand, or what was going on in that time when there was radio silence from Diane Abbot?
What actually happened was that a friend of mine tried to negotiate with them on my behalf, and in the end the leadership said, well, we'll restore the whip, but then you have to stand down within hours. And I wasn't prepared to do that, and I spoke to local Labour Party members and they said you can't do that.
To Keir? Did you speak to him directly?
No. I'm saying I spoke to people locally in my local party and they said you can't do that.
But I'm just wondering, did you ever take that to the Labour leader and say,
no.
don't bully me?
Why would I have that sort of relationship with Sir Keir Starmer? I didn't take it to him, no. I just, you kind of understood what was going on. One of the reasons I knew what was going on was I had been reselected unanimously in 2023. And then in the coming months, first of all, they removed my officers, my chair, my secretary, all of that. And the party hadn't done anything. They hadn't done anything. They were just removed. And they parachuted in new officers who lived in the constituency, but people didn't really know. Then the next thing that happened was that people were strutting around Hackney North believing that they were going to be the next Diane Abbot. But of course, in order to be the next Diane Abbot, you have to get rid of the old Diane Abbot. And that's not how it worked out. But it was clear, even before the letter to the Observer, that I was the culmination of the purge. But it didn't work out for them.
Did you ever think about stepping down? I mean, would you have taken that as a deal?
No.
Would you have stood as an independent?
No. And actually, no. I would hint at it just to upset the people around Starmer, but no, I wasn't prepared to take the deal. In the end, I thought if they want to get rid of me, it's on them. They should do it. I'm not going to make it easy for them.
Do you have any sense from Keir Starmer now of whether he's happy that you're an MP or whether he wishes he weren't?
As I said, I don't really know Keir, but given the firmness, the intentness of wanting to get rid of me, I don't think he's happy I'm still an MP.
How do you think he's doing now? I mean, in the book, I think you accuse him on Gaza of making the same mistakes as Blair did on Iraq, being too cosy with the US administration. Last night we heard him say very directly that he would stand up to bullies like Putin. I guess there is a very stark difference, isn't there, having a Labour leader now who will take on Putin compared to the position that Corbyn did, which was to say, well, we don't want to fund Ukraine, we don't want to send arms to Ukraine, we're not sure about the Skripal poisoning and whether that can be laid at Putin's door. There was always a lot of grey area, wasn't there?
You've forgotten. Back in the day, Tony Blair was quite close to Putin. I think there was this
I haven't actually, and I did raise that with Tony Blair when I interviewed him.
Yeah,
but
no.
Corbyn was much more recent. Corbyn was 2019.
Yeah,
you know, we'd already seen the first invasion of Ukraine, and we had also heard from Jeremy Corbyn when the invasion happened that he didn't think it was right to arm Ukraine.
There has to be an intervention by somebody.
So you wouldn't, but just to be clear, I mean, would you have, if you'd been Prime Minister now, which could have happened,
well,
would you be sending British material, guns, armaments to Ukraine?
I would not be sending material which would allow the invasion of Russia. Indeed, Biden himself has actually vetoed, I think he's vetoed fighter jets.
The Ukrainians are very clear that they don't want to do that. They simply want to reclaim the territory that's theirs.
There are also artillery equipment that could do that. So
it's incredibly dangerous, that position, isn't it?
Jeremy's always been a kind of person that's peace orientated with Gaza. He was calling for a ceasefire before Starmer.
And why wouldn't he have done that? Why was he pacifying Putin then?
No, Jeremy's not an accomplice of Putin. I mean, he's just
Didn't
not.
say he was an accomplice. But why would you want to make life easy for Putin? He appeared on
it wasn't about
Russia Today, didn't he? I mean, there was always that very grey area in that relationship.
Characterising Jeremy as an apologist for communist Russia isn't right.
I don't think it is communist Russia. It's the Putin regime. I mean, that's what we're talking about now. We're talking about a megalomaniac who's invaded another country.
We're talking about communist Russia.
Putin.
Jeremy has never been an accomplice of that. Never. I've known him for 40 years. Never.
Okay. How do you think Labour's doing now?
I think ordinary party members are still euphoric that we won, and won with such a massive majority. Because in 2019, it didn't seem likely that we would win in that relatively short space of time. So I think the members are euphoric, and we'll have to see how it all unrolls. The thing that has upset Labour members most recently was means testing the winter fuel allowance. People were very upset about that. And I have to say to you, Jeremy was not an accomplice to Soviet Russia, and he would never have mean tested the winter fuel allowance. That's the difference.
I guess, to quote Starmer, they are not a party of protest. They're a party of power now, and they're making decisions because they earn the votes to get into power.
Making decisions to take money off pensioners. I mean, come on. I mean, there were other... given there's a 22 billion black hole, there were other ways to raise that money apart from taking it off pensioners. And it tells you something about the way the current leadership thinks.
They're facing a lot of questions at the moment, Keir Starmer in particular, about, I don't know what you call it, Freebiegate or taking donations or borrowing a penthouse. Do you have sympathy with somebody who is right in the public eye, who's clearly trying very hard to protect his family at the moment and has made decisions that have now come back to haunt him? Do you think that this is a sort of a media spin, or do you think that it's an incredibly stupid way to behave?
I think the media has really wound up this whole stuff. I mean, Keir isn't corrupt. Nobody in the current cabinet is corrupt. There are some aspects of it I'm just surprised by. For instance, that he filmed a TV broadcast in the apartment of his millionaire friend Wahid Ali. Why would you do that? You could have filmed it in Labour Party headquarters. He could even have filmed it in his own home, tidied up his living room and done it there.
The donor story that people will associate you with, Diane, is not a Labour donor, but the Conservative donor, Frank Hester, who was racist, abusive, violent in his comments about you, which presumably you never knew until they were dug up by the papers, by the media. Did you ever have a conversation with Frank Hester?
He rang me the day after it was all in The Guardian, but I didn't want to speak to him. How can you want to have somebody shot and think you can ring them and speak to them and say you're sorry? So My staff dealt with it.
Did you ever talk to him?
No. Why would I talk to him?
Did that bring you closer to the Labour leadership? Did they rally round? Or was there a sense then of, Jesus, you know, Diane's been out in the cold and we've got to get to her aid now?
Remember, they'd removed the whip, and I think they thought they could attack Frank Hester without bringing me into it, which was, I mean, they soon learned they couldn't, but that was their original idea, I think. So they wrote letters trying to raise money from members, talking about Frank Hester, but not talking about me.
Did they talk to you?
No.
Keir Starmer didn't talk to you?
No.
And
I mean,
Joanne?
no. I mean, I was in the chamber that Wednesday. It was Prime Minister's Questions, the same week that the Hester stuff was in the newspapers. And it was strange because I was the main topic in Prime Minister's Questions. All the party leaders spoke about it, but the Speaker wouldn't call me. And so afterwards, Stephen Flynn, SNP, I don't really know, but he came up and said, you know, I'm really sorry, they shouldn't have done that to you. And I think Keir Starmer saw that, and he came up to talk to me because I was sitting on the back bench, and he said to me, is there anything I can do? And I said, you know what, you can give me the whip back. And he said again, yes, but is there anything I can do? I said, yeah, you can give me the whip back. And he just went. They wanted to make the most of the Frank Hester thing, but somehow make me marginal.
Last question, Diane. Maybe it's the hardest. How are you?
I'm fine. I can't get over the fact that despite everything people did, I'm still a Labour Party MP.
Diane Abbot, thank you. So before we go, what is your favourite line of Strangeland?
Oh, my favourite line.
Conclusion.
The end.
Yeah, the end. When I finally finished writing it. I don't know. It was a really fun, exhausting thing to write, because I just kind of was troubled by all that happened on January the 6th in Washington and thought, Christ, could the same thing happen here? And then you come back in 2022 from America and you see 3 prime ministers in 1 year, where, you know, after I'd voted when I was sort of 19 years old, there was 3 prime ministers in 28 years. And you thought, my God, what is happening to our political system? And it's about, you know, how sturdy are our institutions and some of what is corroding them. And that's broadly the book. There are bits of optimism, though. It doesn't quite end on let's go and slash our wrists now, but, you know, there is cause for concern.
How sturdy do you think that the bar tab is going to be tonight at your book launch?
Sturdy.
Yeah? Are you sure?
Sturdy.
Good, well, that's a relief.
Yeah, and so anyway, so we'll have a bit of a knees up tonight, and then it's the National Podcast Awards, I think.
Well, we'll either have a knees up or
knees down.
Well, quite exactly, and then we'll
Knees
just
down.
do what everybody.
My favourite kind of social event.
We're having a knees down tonight.
What everyone does with all
Bye-bye.
awards, which is if they win them, celebrate and laud the awards, and if we lose them, then say that we never wanted to win anyway, and it's all rigged.
Overbearing in victory, surly in defeat. That's the newsagents. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.